I think it's fascinating in a way to see a Japanese author take an American kind of trope and add all these other elements into it and deal with something similar to what that world was built on, you know? Like it's dealing with racism and the sexism and the horrors of violent brutality that existed in that era through the mirror of vampires and doing it very, very well.
In the distant future, vampires rule the night, but their numbers are dwindling. One podcast is unlike all the others. Half human, half vampire. This is Lefty Speaks, the official podcast for Vampire Hunter D.
And that was the next thing I think that you touched on in your video was the influences that Kikuchi has talked about from his history with what inspired him that he's talked about in a number of interviews for Westerns, Hammer films, depictions of, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and Japanese Middle Ages feudal culture history. So I'd love to break that apart and dive into a little bit about discussing, starting on the Westerns and the Hammer films, as we've talked about, Fistful of Dollars, Good, Bad, and the Ugly in the past, how that reached beyond just U.S. cinema.
To my knowledge, he, like many people of that era, after the war, like everything was devastated. You were rebuilding. There was not much of an artistic industry left, in part because a lot of it was just absorbed by the mainstream, the kind of war culture, and they were writing things that really nobody reads anymore because they were propaganda, they were bad, that kind of thing.
Yep.
And so the media was Western. They were watching Western movies, and especially Dracula, Frankenstein, that kind of thing was coming to them for the first time in movie form. I think the books were translated pretty close to that time, but most folks were seeing Dracula for the first time through Christopher Lee. And I read somewhere that to this day, a term in Japan for vampire is just Draculas. And, that was like their first vampire, because they don't really have a native tradition in the same way that a lot of places in Europe and different places have some similar kind of blood-sucking traditions. So, it's clear that like he fell in love with that kind of, that story, that archetype, the monster, the setting, and in his very early books copied it not copied, but like did his own version of the archetype very well, and then became, I think, confident enough to really start playing with it and adapting, adding new elements in really interesting ways.
It's kind of like how in Western cultures, we have a resurrection motif, and in Eastern religions, you have the wheel and a resurrection motif. Not a resurrection, a reincarnation motif, sorry.
Yeah.
And I find the difference between those two very interesting. As you commented, the Japanese, they don't hold blood as anything special or sacred.
Unless it's Hideyuki Anno,
Yes.
Evangelion, the blood. Anyway, I'm sorry, the LCO.
And his if I remember right, the whole reason he did all that was because he thought it looked interesting and weird, and he knew it would just not really mean anything necessarily to the Japanese. It would be esoteric and strange, which is great. I love that.
No, it's the funniest conversation I ever had, which showed me how ignorant I was at the end of Princess Mononoke. I used to work with this company, and I had a Japanese buddy, and we both watched it. We walked out of Mononoke with very different interpretations of the ending. And at the very end, spoiler, the little Kodama walks back out after everything is destroyed. And I said, oh, wow, the forest god is reborn. And he said, no, he's not. He's dead. I'm like, no, but the Kodama came back out. And he said, no, he's dead. And so we went back and forth. And then eventually he was like, you're from a Christ-based society. So you think somebody was resurrected. He didn't know. The forest god is gone. And that's it. And And I was like, wow, I never thought I had been indoctrinated that deeply to apply the Christian, I'm not going to say mythology, but the Christian belief
Mhm.
into everything I watched. I
One
mean,
of the
everything,
yeah,
you know?
one of the more interesting things I've had is I was at a convention with Taliesin Jaff, and he did a presentation on how the English language has shaped things because the
Mm.
English language is a Christian language. And
Oh,
he's like, I know
wow.
that's going to upset a bunch of people. You're going to be upset. But if you look at history,
Hmm.
Christianity shaped the English language because the English
Right.
language is a bastard hybridization of a bunch of other languages. That's why we
Hmm.
have rules that make no sense, that are constantly broken, and English is the most messed up language of the world. If we had to pick a language that, somehow was, the language of business, wow, did we pick wrong?
Mm.
And his example of a test is, look up what blasphemy is and try to go for a day without committing blasphemy,
Mm.
because Christianity and Christian terms are so woven into the English language. Everybody who's tried it in the Middle Ages, they tried to make laws against it and they had to strike them because they couldn't keep them. And it's crazy how much to think that influences the way we interpret everything. And that's
Yeah.
that's one of the things I find fascinating about other cultures, and hearing Kevin talk about the translation, because he's like, there are things in Japanese that don't translate well because you don't have the background to understand it. And I'll talk to my mom about things, and she's like, yeah, I need to explain this for it to make sense to you. And it's this way because, oh, so you spell it that way because of the historical context, not because of how it would be spelled in any other way, but because there's some story behind it. Oh, okay, that makes more sense. Sort of. But I didn't grow up with that story and influence, so I just have to take your word for it that, and I think every culture's got its own mess of that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You
Yeah.
try to tell somebody what it means when you say it's raining cats and dogs. People, like, I've said that to people, and they're like, what the f? What do you what? People from from other countries, and I'm like, oh, it's raining cats and dogs out there. They're like, cats and dogs are falling from the sky. I'm like, no, that's not what that means. But anyway,
Yeah.
it's a good example.
No, I love this conversation because when I first moved to LA, the first thing I did was I was an ESL teacher to refugees. And so
Wow.
I taught English to people from between 52 and 56 different countries.
Mm-hmm.
And just like you're saying, I mean, like it was every day, every day. I mean, I loved it. Not, it wasn't the career I wanted to do, but it was so fun. It was a really fun job because I heard stories from, firsthand stories from almost everywhere in the world, and from perspectives almost all over the world. And it really opens your eyes. I mean, it just on how, and then to circle back, how brilliant it is to, to write a novel that can resonate with people all over the world,
Mm-hmm.
and really tell stories about, about, commentary about Japan, and the West, in a brilliant series. Yeah.
I think the blending of cultures is the secret to that. Like
Yes.
it's very similar. Another work I work a lot with is Silent Hill, and the very first
Mm-hmm.
game
Oh, nice.
is,
Oh my God.
American city, Japanese team blending these ideas together, and it really resonated in the West a lot, and
Hmm.
I mean across the globe. Not so much in Japan. Siren and Fatal Frame were more popular, but I mean
Mm-hmm.
from South America
Oh,
to
right.
Russia, this Silent Hill is huge. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it is because it blends things that are familiar with things that are unfamiliar so that you don't feel entirely like you're out to sea, but there's something different and it
Mm-hmm.
draws you in.
Gets you out of your own world, because with entertainment, I think we want to get away from our immediate life. We want our imagination to be stretched into, you know be well outside our immediate circle, expand the universe kind of thing.
Yeah.
Silent Hill is particularly insane because there's a town in Pennsylvania really like that, where it had some kind of
Yeah.
underground accident, and the gases, whatever, keep people out. And I just thought, oh,
Yeah.
well, I'm not going to be stupid enough to go there, but the idea that place exists, is pretty insane.
I have to make
we went and visited
Oh, you went there?
Yeah. Well, because Davis
Oh my
Films,
God.
we made the Resident Evil films. So Resident
my
Evil and
God.
Silent Hill movies.
Right.
Right. So I joined Davis Films right after the first Silent Hill film had been filmed. So we were still in the editing process.
Awesome.
But for Silent Hill 2, yeah, we went and visited, because there was an earlier version that didn't make it. So we had to make some changes, but that it almost recycled around when we did the PT with Kojima, and that was just huge. So disappointing.
Yeah.
I mean, it was good. We knew it was going to happen because Kojima was absolutely not happy with Konami. So we knew we were hoping we could get. I mean, it was just this beautiful blend. Norman Reedus. I mean, it was all
Yeah.
moving forward, and we were all so excited. And then, nope, not gonna happen. But yeah, I'm a huge fan, obviously, of Silent Hill, having worked on it for
Awesome.
over a decade. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
my YouTube career started with Silent Hill, and I think I have more
Wow.
than 100 videos on the series now, documentaries, all kinds of things. Vampire Hunter D's got to catch up. I only have 2, but I'm working on it. And I have to say, just because it's a legal requirement, and my fans will get mad if I don't, Centralia is the inspiration behind the movie, but not the game. Because some
Right.
folks
Correct.
they like to bother the devs about it, and Ito Masahiro gets very angry because he's
Yeah.
heard it so many times.
Yeah,
should
no,
talk
Roger Avery was really obsessive about that about it. So yeah.
Speaking of game, we should talk about that Vampire Hunter D video game at some point. I did
I
play
lo-
it.
I
on the
have
play-
it.
on the
I've
PS1.
never
I
played
played
it.
it. It's very clunky. It should be called Vampire Hunter D Clunky.
It's a poor Devil May Cry-ish kind
Oh,
of clone.
It wishes.
It really
Oh
wishes.
my God. The
it
isometric
wants-
view. I mean, I don't even know if it's the weirdest camera. Anyway,
We're going to have to
Yeah.
pull people together to discuss the pros and cons of different genres of possible video game adaptations. Because the two that actually, no, I'm not going to go there. We're going to derail if we do that.
Yeah, no, let's get
we're going to
back
table
to-
that as a future discussion.
Yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to really dig into is the feudal inspiration. And you dedicated a decent chunk of time in your video talking about feudal Japan. And I also see a lot of parallels to, feudal Europe, feudal China, how the people who put themselves at the top believed they, by divine mandate or whatever justification they had, wanted to rule with an iron fist. They took what they wanted. And this included, just claiming women, stabbing people for whatever reason caught their fancy. You looked at me funny, so I'm going to stake you to the ground with my sword and let you slowly bleed to death painfully. And that was just society.
Yeah.
And, when I see movies that romanticize a lot of the Middle Ages and, knights and princes and nobles, I then think of films like Braveheart, where, the king has no repercussion from he just tosses a dude out the window because he doesn't like him because, oh, Philip is my counsel. Well, Philip, I don't like you because you're sleeping with my son, and I don't like that because you're not producing errors if he's sleeping with you. So, and the guards look at the body, look up, see the king, and just walk away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was really indicative of part of the problem with having that unrestricted nobility. It's abuse whoever you can below you while trying not to be abused by the people above you while trying to be the person on top. And
that's why I love that they use the word nobility in that way so specifically. I mean, it just it floods the mind with images and not kind of in the positive way,
Yeah.
right? And I really love that.
What I think is really powerful about the way that Vampire Hunter D uses it, and you mentioned there's lots of different feudalism, and each one kind of functions a little differently. I'm no scholar of all of them.
Mhm.
I know China had a little bit more of a little more moralistic, legalistic. They had a lot of bureaucracy in place. There was kind
Mhm.
of ways you could try and go about getting justice. Obviously, money was going to help you way more than anything. Um, in Japan specifically, feudalism, I think, has been far more damaging for a lot of reasons. One of which that it lasted so much longer and it was so much stricter in
Mhm.
terms of social, like, norms. There was no moving up or down the social ladder, technically. At certain points, you kind of could. And there was no real avenue for addressing grievances. There's a story of a bunch of farmers whose overlord was basically starving them to death, and that's who they
Mm.
were supposed to go to if they had grievances. So they tried to go to the guy above him, and he was involved. So the only way they could get any help was to go directly to, I think it was the shogun, and that's a crime. Farmers are not allowed to speak to the shogun, but one man manages to run up to his like palanquin or chariot and throw a letter in. And so the shogun finds out, he rights the wrong. But as punishment for what the man has done, his whole family is killed. He has to watch his children be beheaded in front of him, and he and his wife are crucified because they dared to throw a letter at the shogun. And that's just the law. And the family was considered like incredible martyrs for their community because they saved them from starvation. And everybody was kind of cool with this. And so, to a certain extent, you can't really revolt because though they did a lot, they had no weapons. The samurais took everything. The samurai had all the swords, and they had near complete control over who lived or who died. A really kind of funny but interesting way to kind of learn more, or not learn, but see this in action is the show Samurai Cat, which if you saw the viral picture of a samurai holding a white cat from many years ago, it's a real TV show. And it's kind of comically dealing with the samurai era. And it does show like a one guy is going to murder this dude because he stepped in his cat's poop. And so he's just going to kill him. And the other samurai has to intervene and be like, what are you doing, bro? This is crazy. And it kind of has a modern character who's adapting into a more maybe it's more important that we take care of each other than just strike each other down with swords. And so pulling more from Japanese feudalism in Vampire Hunter D, where the way that the land is set up, the way that the nobility is venerated, you can't even talk to him, you can't even look at him. The way that they feed off the people in the same way that
Mm.
the samurai were fed by the rice that the farmers grew, and the farmers normally didn't even get to eat the rice. They had to eat like uh, some kind of off-brand wheat, and so all those kind of parallels really makes me think it's pulling much more strongly from Japanese feudalism, even though all the visual trappings are more Western. And I think that's powerful because even I think into Kikuchi's era, they were still dealing with the problems of feudalism because having
It's
feudalism
still
last so
there.
long, yeah, having it last so long unnaturally, and then having it break so suddenly because of the black ships and World War II, like those are problems they're still dealing with, and we had a much more natural kind of development of human freedom and kind of individuality because we kind of came out of it more slowly. We had a lot more philosophy kind of building up, and they had it just broke so fast. How do you change that mindset?
It's part of. So here's a bit of my perspective on it because my mom's family is a noble family. They were a samurai clan. Broke World War II. But so I learned that names tell you who was a noble family and who was a commoner who was given a family name after World War II. Because the commoner names were pulled from where your village was, or your geographical features, or your job, something about life. So it has a translation. It could be, your shrimp farmers, your fish farmers, you're a hunter, you're a forester, you're a blacksmith, your trade. So all of those things influenced the names people took as their family names when now everybody's got a family name. But if you're a samurai clan, it's a distinctly different name because it's a part of history going back of you were, one of the samurai clans, you were part of the shogunate. So to this day, you can tell which families, where the background was, just because of the family name. And that, when I learned that, I was like, what? And my mom was telling me, because I mentioned some of the people in Japan we were with, and she goes, oh, their name translates to this, so their family must have, at World War II, come from, a village that did this. Like, wait, what? What about your family name? Oh, well, that's a samurai name. And so that divide still hits today. When my grandmother was buried, because of the family name, they asked, are you registered with a shrine as a samurai clan? They go, yeah. But all that meant was that at the funeral, her casket had some ornaments, like a sword and the family clan sign on it. But if you weren't registered with the temple and recognized clan, you didn't get that. Practically, there's no difference, but it's still there down to funerals. And yeah, that's something that takes a long time to adjust.
Yeah, I'd argue we aren't even fully, completely divorced from our ideas of social hierarchy, and we've been out of feudalism for hundreds of years,
And do you think that with how distinct that was for Japanese feudalism and how it drives like kind of the world building and story, do you think that's part of why you see D not changing and he changes the world around him, for that idea that the world in Japan didn't change for centuries, but if you were anybody but the people at the top, you really wanted change?
Yeah. That does kind of reflect how slowly, like technically they were under military rule for 800 years. Who was in charge changed. Some of the, how rough it was changed, but they still didn't really have a say and were pretty restricted compared to places around the world. And yeah, it took a long time, even to today. Change is still really far back. They're still like one of the worst countries for women, and it's rough. And I think
Age
D.
discrimination in hiring is legal.
Mm-hmm. And D is interesting. I think he is kind of a symbol of some of the more the forbidden, the gothic, the things that we want that aren't good for us. Kind of a representation of how power can be used to help and can be deadly, because there are powerful vampires who are killing people, but there are powerful vampires who are trying to help. And D, in a way, kind of feels like a demigod or a god figure, opposed to his father. The man that he's following is a kind of a Satan, an evil god who acts as a tempter in a way, that pulls a lot of the darkness out of humans. They are making the choices, but they are being tempted by an evil god. And this is even all reinforced by the fact that he wrote a proposed epilogue for the series where D and Dracula, or the ancestor, fight at the place where like Revelations is supposed to happen. The final showdown between angels and devils. I can't remember what it's called, but
Armageddon.
yes, the plains of Armageddon, the fields of Armageddon, and he wrote a short story where they fight there, and it feels really a lot like, in some ways, it's a very oddly, uniquely framed tale of angels versus demons, God versus Satan, with humans in between, kind of making the choices, and so there's almost a mythological element to it that feels really interesting to me.
Well, certainly the nobility in some ways is a reflection of that we've seen in a lot of mythology. I mean, like we look at like Greek mythology, the hedonism and the lack of care for humanity, for
Mm-hmm.
humans. It's just they're playthings, and I mean, and obviously different myth, lore, folklore, mythology around the world definitely deals with things in slightly different ways. So it's not always the case,
Mm-hmm.
but at least, when we're looking at Greek mythology, for example, they were the gods were as flawed as humans in
Mhm.
many ways, just in an extreme way, so that it was like a lesson for us to how not to be
Yeah. I
in many ways.
I think of this cartoon strip I saw once talking about Greek mythology. It said Greek mythology, and it has a book, that's this tall, and then next to it is Greek mythology if Zeus could keep it in his pants.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
funny. It's funny you say that because all the major heroes or heroines in the Greek pantheon, they were all seem to be, children of ill birth.
Mm-hmm.
Where Zeus
Bastards.
did something he wasn't supposed to do, and you go to like Theseus or Heracles or Hercules, however you want to say it. Person after person after person, the children of Zeus or one of his brothers or whatever, they were the ones written about almost as if illegitimate birth was a way to become great. You had to be touched by the gods, figuratively and literally. And that's something to think about because D is definitely that character,
The
Mm-hmm.
oldest
literally.
story in the world is Gilgamesh, and he is
Mm,
the son of a god and a human, and I think that kind of
right.
talks to our interest in characters that are in between worlds, that kind of
The liminal
not
state,
quite
right,
fitting. Yeah.
right. Very true.
Also, I think gives us a way to put if you will, the Herculean task of saving the world, changing things, into a character that is superhuman. That's how they're able to accomplish it. And I wonder, for some of the different eras where a lot of these stories came from, even to today, when we talk about, our superhero stories, a lot of the stories that were written, I mean, you think of the Captain America stories. Well, who's he fighting originally when Captain America came out? He's fighting the Nazis. He's fighting Red Skull,
Hmm.
because it's a horrific fight. You hear stories of veterans and that fought in different wars, and yeah, there's a lot of trauma. The humanity, we don't do well with the trauma of people, soldiers who fought in war. That leaves scars far beyond physical. Like I remember for my dad, he would talk about basic training. He would talk about meeting my mom after he got out of a hospital in Japan while he was recovering. I never heard a single story about combat in Vietnam, about being, in Vietnam. And so when I got older, I realized why. And so I never asked.
Yeah.
I figured if he wanted to talk about it, he would talk about it. He talked about everything around it. And I think that's one of the things when you look at some of the characters around D and they talk about their trauma and how it's shaped their lives and them trying to deal with it. To me, that's another great thing about fiction literature is to try and address that human suffering, that element that I think it's far more convenient for us to try and ignore, because it is something that is really, really difficult to touch on.
Yeah, and D as a character, his power being half noble, half human, it kind of makes him safe in a way for these people who are, maybe running from vampires or just hunters who've lived on the road their whole life. He becomes a kind of gateway for people to deal with things that they couldn't have on their own, but he never manages to solve everything. He's not actually a god. And it kind of I like the balance where he's capable of doing more for people than they could possibly do for themselves, but he can't fix the world. And it's still gonna have problems that maybe the humans themselves are gonna have to fix. Some of the books
Mhm.
end with, like, book 2, where the kid goes to the capital to learn, and he's gonna try and study and do better. There's a lot of characters that kind of are like that, where it kind of implies there's a
Mhm.
slow growing, improvement of the world, and he's
Right.
contributing.
Yeah, problems don't get fixed overnight, so there's no magic wand.
Don't we all wish?
And even in the stories where they had the magic wand, there's a reason the Elder Wand got buried.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a really lovely novel, the Lath or Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K.
Mm.
Le Guin, where
Mhm.
a character ends up with kind of the power to wish away problems, and it just makes the world kind of bland. Like, he wishes away racism, and now everyone's gray, and so no one really has culture, and it's kind of a dull world. Really powerful book. I really liked.
Thank you for listening to Lefty Speaks, the official Vampire Hunter D podcast, hosted by Brandon Easton, Neal Fischer, and Scott McLean. This podcast is created by Unified Pictures and 9 Realms. Narration by Lauren Evallen-Muller. Recording and editing by 9 Realms. Produced by Scott McLean and Ian E. Muller. Based on the works created by Hideyuki Kikuchi. Happy hunting.